It was supposed to be a family dinner, the kind where laughter drifted over the smell of cinnamon and roasted pie, where everyone pretended gratitude was effortless. But that year, gratitude was a performance, and I was the only one who refused to play along. The thin clatter of silverware, the polished smiles, the endless stories about success, all of it barely concealed the quiet cruelty simmering beneath. My father's words cut through the room like a verdict: "Clara, you've never earned what this family built." My brother smirked, lifting his wine glass. "Not everyone deserves the will, Dad." The sound that followed wasn't real. It was rehearsed like a well-practiced play we performed every Thanksgiving. I watched the light refract off the massive crystal chandelier, each sharp facet casting a judging gleam on the faces below. From the outside, we were the Evans family, founders of Evans Construction, respected, admired, envied. From the inside, we were a machine that ran on comparison and quiet humiliation. I had learned long ago that silence was safer than defense. Every time I tried to speak, someone reminded me that logic was wasted on creative types. So that night I simply smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. I sliced my pie, my fork scraping faintly against the plate. That sound, small, sharp, deliberate, was the only protest I allowed myself. Dad leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine like he was making a point even before he spoke. "You've had every opportunity, Clara, but you chose to waste your time chasing ideas instead of results." Lucas's laugh, a thin, reedy sound like rusted brass, followed as if on cue. "Yeah, Dad. Maybe one day she'll figure out how real business works. You know, numbers, not dreams." Their amusement rippled around the table. Aunts chuckled dryly. Cousins hid their snickers behind their napkins. Even my mother gave me a soft, apologetic look, the kind that said, "Don't make this harder than it already is." I wanted to tell them that I had been working harder than any of them could imagine. While they mocked my ideas, I was building something real. But saying that now would only feed their amusement. So I let the words die in my throat, swallowing them like I'd done 100 times before. Instead, I looked up straight at my father. "You're right," I said quietly. "I did waste time. Just not in the way you think." That made him pause, fork halfway to his mouth. Lucas rolled his eyes. "Here we go again." "Lucas," my mother warned softly, but her voice had no strength left in it. Dad set his glass down with a sigh, heavy enough to fill the room. "Clara, this isn't an argument. It's a fact. You've made your choices. Lucas has proven himself. He'll take the company forward." There it was, the unspoken truth finally spoken aloud. "You're out. He's in." My heart didn't race this time. I had already heard this sentence years ago, the night they cut me off, the night I realized I would never be part of Evans Construction. Not in name, not in spirit, not in inheritance. But what they didn't know was that I had stopped wanting to be. "Of course," I said softly. "It's always been Lucas." Lucas grinned, raising his glass again. "At least someone finally agrees with me." The room filled with laughter once more, a high, brittle noise like clashing shards of glass. I sat still, my pulse steady, the taste of apple pie fading into something metallic on my tongue. If I had spoken the truth and that I had been quietly building something of my own, that the people he trusted had already begun investing in me, they would have laughed harder. So I said nothing. I simply watched them. The way Lucas's cufflinks caught the light. The way Dad's reflection gleamed in his wine glass. The way everyone avoided meeting my eyes, afraid I might ruin the illusion that everything in this family was perfect. Aunt May leaned in, smiling too sweetly. "So, Clara, are you still doing your little tech thing?" "My little tech thing?" I almost laughed. "Something like that," I said, my tone calm, almost disinterested. "She's still chasing those computer dreams," Lucas added, and the table burst into another round of amusement. This time I didn't smile. I looked straight at him. "Dreams build faster than concrete, Lucas. You'd be surprised how strong they get when everyone tells you they'll fall apart." He blinked, caught off guard for a second, but quickly recovered with a shrug. "We'll see about that." We would. I picked up my glass, taking a sip of water, my fingers steady. Beneath the table, my phone buzzed once, a vibration so subtle no one noticed. I glanced at the screen, David Walker, attorney at law. The message preview flashed, "Call me when you can." It's about the shares. My heart didn't skip. It settled. I locked the screen and slid the phone face down beside my plate. The noise around me grew faint, distant, like I was watching a scene I'd already seen too many times before. My father was boasting about Lucas's deals. My mother pretended not to notice the tension. My cousins nodded along. But this time, something was different. I wasn't the same girl who used to shrink under their words. I wasn't the one they could cut out without consequence. I was there for a reason. As the laughter faded and the pie plates emptied, my father raised his glass for a toast. To family and to success, to the future Evans legacy. Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except me. I watched them clink crystal against crystal, all smiles and pride. Then I lifted my glass last, my voice barely above a whisper. To new beginnings. No one noticed. No one ever did. But later that night they would. Because when my attorney called again, it wouldn't be about some little tech thing. It would be the call that rewrote the entire Evans legacy. And this time my silence would be the loudest sound in the room. The day my father rewrote his will, the air in his office was heavy with the scent of old paper and cool, stagnant silver. I remember the way sunlight filtered through the blinds, striping the mahogany desk where a stack of papers waited like a quiet dismantling of my life. My name wasn't on any of them. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Clara, you're talented, but talent doesn't build legacies. Discipline does. Commitment does. And you've shown neither." I stood in front of him, hands at my sides, heart beating too loudly in the stillness. "I've been working, Dad. Just because it's not your way doesn't mean it's worthless." He finally looked up, his eyes cold but calm, the way a judge looks at someone who's already lost. "You've been playing with ideas. Your brother's been working with results." Lucas leaned against the doorframe behind me, perfectly dressed, confident, his smirk deliberate. "Don't take it personally, Clara. You know how business works. You invest where the return is real." My throat tightened. But I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "So that's it," I said quietly. "You're cutting me out," Dad sighed as if the conversation bored him. "We're not cutting you out. We're protecting the company. You've made your choice. We can't support experiments." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every word landed with the precision of a hammer. I glanced at the papers again, the signatures, the neat columns of assets, the way Lucas's name appeared again and again like it was the only one that mattered. Lucas straightened, folding his arms. "Don't make this harder than it is. You'll find your path. Just somewhere else. Somewhere else." That night I sat in my old room, the one that used to smell like paint and graphite and late-night ideas. My shelves were still filled with blueprints, sketches, and the models I'd built by hand. My father used to walk past those models and shake his head. "Art doesn't build companies," he'd say. Maybe not. But I'd always known art builds vision. The hallway outside echoed with laughter. My father on the phone with investors. My mother reminding him about dinner, Lucas telling another story about his latest client. I used to be part of that world, standing just outside the spotlight. Now I wasn't even in the room. I picked up one of my old designs, a miniature model of a sustainable home I'd built in college. The edges were uneven, a little rough, but the structure stood perfectly balanced. "You'll never make a living with this," Dad had said back then. I smiled faintly, brushing dust from its roof. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wouldn't make a living with it, but I'd make a life. The next morning I packed a single suitcase, clothes, laptop, sketchbook. My mother stood by the door, fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. I looked at her. "If I stay, I'll spend my life trying to prove I belong. If I go, at least, I'll belong to myself." She didn't answer. She just stepped aside. Lucas waited by the staircase, his coffee steaming, that same smirk on his lips. "Leaving already." "Guess Dad was right about your commitment issues." I paused, my hand tightening on the railing. "You should hope I fail, Lucas. It's easier to live with your success that way. He laughed low and amused. You'll be back. People like you always are. People like me. The dreamers. The ones who think ideas matter more than control. I walked past him without another word. The air outside hit me like a slap-sharp cold clean. The Evans house stood behind me, perfect and heavy with its own arrogance, the kind of perfection that cracks quietly before it collapses. My car was old, dented, and barely held together, but it started on the first try. I sat for a moment staring at the front door. Dad's shadow moved behind the glass, pacing already on another call. He didn't even look out the window. I should have cried. I didn't. I felt something else, a cold emptiness, as if every chain had just broken free. I had spent years chasing approval in that house, begging for acknowledgement that was never going to come. Now, for the first time, I didn't need it. When I drove away, the city opened in front of me, crowded, loud, alive. I rented a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat downtown. The walls were cracked, the air smelled faintly of detergent and metal, and the floor creaked under every step. But it was mine. I set my laptop on the small table by the window and opened a blank document. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. Company name to be decided. I stared at it, then typed 2 words: Evolve, Build. It wasn't about construction anymore, it was about rebuilding what they'd torn down. In the months that followed, I worked in silence. Days blurred into nights. The roar of the industrial washing machines below would sometimes wake me at 4 a.m., the vibrations rattling the window pane above my desk. The smell of cheap laundry detergent clung to my rough drafts, but I learned to live with it. My only companions were the hum of my computer and the quiet determination that came from knowing no one expected anything from me. I taught myself new software pitched to people who barely looked up from their phones got rejected more times than I could count. But every no hardened into fuel. There were nights I wanted to quit. Sometimes I caught myself whispering, maybe Dad was right. But then I'd remember the look on his face when he signed that will, that certainty that I'd fade into nothing, and it would pull me back to the screen. When the first small investor replied, I almost didn't believe it. The email was short, almost casual. We like your concept. Can you meet on Tuesday? I reread it 5 times before letting myself smile. That was the moment I realized I didn't need my father's approval, his company, or his name. I just needed someone willing to see what he never did. Still, there were nights I'd wake up and wonder what they were saying about me. If they laughed when my name came up. If my mother still kept a photo of me on the mantle, or if it had quietly disappeared. Maybe it didn't matter. I wasn't building something to prove them wrong anymore. I was building something that would outlive their laughter. Years later, when people ask me why I started Evolve Build, I never told them it began with a will or the day my father crossed my name out of his. But it did. And while they thought they were ending my story, what they really did was give me the perfect first chapter. Lucas was the house's bronze statue, always polished, always gazed upon, forcing everyone else into the dim periphery. Wherever he went, the light followed, and the rest of us just learned to live in his shadow. When we were kids, every photo, every trophy, every whispered compliment belonged to him. Even the hallway in our house was a shrine to his success. Basketball medals, honor roll certificates, glossy photos from business school printed large enough to make visitors stop and admire. My mother dusted those frames like sacred objects. My sketches. They stayed stacked in a box under my bed. When Lucas made varsity, my father bought a new television to watch every game. When I won a statewide design competition, he barely looked up from his newspaper. That's nice, Clara, he'd say, without even asking what I'd built. That's when I learned what mattered in the Evans family: measurable success, not imagination. At family gatherings, they spoke about Lucas like he was already a legend. He has leadership in his blood, Dad would say proudly. He's going to take the company to new heights. People would nod and smile, eyes turning toward Lucas in admiration. When they turned to me, their smiles softened into pity. Still figuring out what you want to do, huh? Someone would always ask. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder. I stopped trying to defend myself. Words meant nothing when your last name wasn't enough to make people listen. I turned my presence into an analytical tool. Every handshake, every averted glance, every superfluous compliment became raw data. I stored them quietly the way a scientist stores evidence before the experiment begins. Lucas didn't just have confidence, he had entitlement. At 26, he was already sitting on the company board, introduced at every meeting as the future of Evans Construction. He wore tailored suits that looked like they were stitched out of his own ego. At networking events, I watched him hold a glass of bourbon like it was a symbol of power, charming investors with his practiced smile. He knew how to perform success even when the numbers didn't back it up. I remember one dinner in particular, another holiday, another stage. Lucas was talking about his latest project, an expansion deal in Chicago that he'd personally secured. My father hung on every word, pride radiating from him like heat. "That's my boy," he said, clapping Lucas on the back. Lucas tilted his head toward me. "You see, Clara, this is what happens when you turn your ideas into certified assets." My fork paused midair. I smiled politely. "I'm happy for you." He grinned. "You should be. Maybe I'll build you a place to live when I'm done with this one." The table laughed. My mother winced, whispering his name softly, but she didn't stop him. She never did. I laughed too, but quietly, the kind of laugh that sounds harmless until you realize it's the last warning before a storm. When dinner ended, I slipped outside into the cold. The night was clear, the air sharp. Behind me, I could still hear them celebrating inside. I stared up at the stars and wondered what it must feel like to be adored so easily. To have people believe in you before you even earned it. Then I realized I didn't want that kind of love, the kind that only lasts as long as you stay perfect. The following year, Lucas graduated from Harvard Business School, and my father threw a gala in his honor. Reporters came, the noise of crystal and silver was a continuous senseless score of self-satisfaction, and every speech ended with the same phrase, "The next generation of Evans Construction." I stood at the back near the exit watching Lucas shake hands with city officials and smiling investors. He looked every bit the part of heir. His fiancée, Elise, a polished, charming PR executive, clung to his arm like she'd already won the lottery. "Clara." My mother appeared at my side, breathless, cheeks flushed. "Smile a little, sweetheart. Tonight's a celebration." "For him," I said softly. "For all of us," she corrected quickly, though even she didn't sound convinced. "You should talk to your father. Maybe he'll let you help with the new marketing branch." I looked at her, then at Lucas standing beneath the chandelier surrounded by applause. "He doesn't want my help, Mom. He wants his reflection." She frowned, not knowing how to respond. I slipped out before the speeches ended. On my way out, I passed a photographer adjusting his lens. Behind him, a large banner stretched across the wall, "Building the Future. Evans Construction." I stopped for a moment, staring at the words. Then I pulled a pen from my purse and on a napkin from the refreshment table scribbled quietly, "The future builds itself." The next morning, a friend from college, Ethan Moore, called out of nowhere. "Clara Evans," he said with a laugh, "I read your old proposal again, the one about integrating AR into architectural design. You were years ahead of everyone. Are you still doing that? Trying to," I admitted. "Don't just try," he said. "Build it. They'll laugh until they need it." Those words stuck. Lucas spent the next few years climbing fast, appearing in magazines, quoted in business journals. I followed quietly, watching not to admire him, but to catalog every contact, every investor, and every weakness in their operations. I learned how to navigate the world they built, not to join it, but to surpass it. When I heard about the company's internal struggles, a few bad deals, some overextended contracts I didn't celebrate, I just watched. Because that's what you do when the favorite son starts to forget that empires built on ego rarely last. At home, they still worshipped him. My father would talk about Lucas's brilliance as if it were divine. My mother would host dinners where Lucas was always seated at the head of the table, his glass always full, his voice always the loudest. No one noticed the silence at the far end of the room anymore. They'd stopped expecting me to speak. And that was fine. Because when people stop expecting anything from you, They stop watching. And when they stop watching, that's when you start to build. So while Lucas soaked in applause, I was sitting in a cramped apartment sketching something that would one day become my first prototype. They called him the family's future. They called me a failure. But every empire needs its shadow. And I was done living in his. It started with a dinner invitation that felt more like a summons. My father never asked to talk. He arranged, decided, and commanded. That night, the air at the Evans dining table was heavier than usual. No laughter, no small talk, just the clink of silver against porcelain and the faint hum of tension. I knew before he spoke that something final was coming. He set down his fork, straightened his tie, and looked at me as though I were a disappointing employee. "Clara," he said, voice steady but sharp, "I think it's time we stop pretending you're interested in the family business." Lucas didn't even look up from his plate. "I told you she'd quit eventually." "I'm not quitting," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I'm starting something new." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Something new? Another one of your projects?" "It's not a project. It's a company," I said. "I've been developing a software platform for virtual design," and he cut me off with a low laugh that chilled more than anger ever could. "Virtual design. Clara, we build skyscrapers, not video games." Lucas finally looked up, smirking. "She's serious, Dad. She thinks architecture is going digital now. Like people are going to wear goggles instead of walking into buildings." "It's called innovation," I said, trying to hold on to my patience. "It's called delusion," my father replied flatly. "And I won't watch you waste another dollar on it." The room went quiet except for the soft crackle of the fireplace. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. "Maybe she just needs some guidance," she said gently. "She's always been creative. She's always been impulsive," Dad interrupted. "Creativity without discipline is chaos, and I will not fund chaos." I stared at him, my chest tightening, my heartbeat loud in my ears. "You're not funding anything, Dad. I've been supporting myself for a year." "Then why are you still here?" he asked, calm but cruel. "If you're so independent, maybe it's time you stop using the Evans name to open doors." Lucas chuckled under his breath. "You could always start a podcast, How to Fail Gracefully." Something inside me snapped, not in rage, but in resolve. I placed my napkin on the table, stood and said, "I'll do it without your name, without your help, without this house." Dad looked unmoved. "If you walk out now, Clara don't expect to walk back in." I nodded slowly. "That's fair." Lucas leaned back, arms folded, tapping his signet ring against his sleeve, his smile as arrogant as if he'd personally written the rulebook. "Good luck paying rent with your little headset dreams." I met his eyes. "I don't need luck. I just need time." I turned to leave, but Dad's voice stopped me halfway to the door. "You think the world cares about your vision? It doesn't. It cares about results. And right now, you have none." I faced him steady. "You're right. But soon I will." I walked out without looking back. That night I packed what little I had, my laptop, a few clothes, a stack of design sketches, and a single framed photo, the one of my grandfather holding me as a child. He had been the last Evans who ever looked at me without disappointment. The rain came hard as I carried boxes to my car. The driveway lights reflected off the wet pavement, turning the world into a blur of gold and gray. My mother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, her face pale. "Clara," she whispered, "please, don't do this." "I have to," I said. Her eyes were wet, but more telling was the absolute paralysis in her arms. She had already chosen her side. "You're more like him than you think," she said quietly. "Then maybe he'll finally respect me," I replied. I drove away before she could answer. My new apartment was nothing like the house I'd left. It smelled faintly of rust and old paint. The heater rattled like it was fighting for its life. I had a mattress on the floor, a folding table for a desk, and a single chair that leaned slightly to the left. But it was mine. I worked until the light from my laptop was the only glow in the room. My first designs were rough, messy, unstable, full of bugs, but I kept building. Every time I hit a wall, I heard my father's voice in my head saying, "You'll fail." Every time I fixed one, I whispered back, "Watch me." The next few weeks blurred into months. My savings thinned to almost nothing. I lived on stale protein bars and warmed my hands on the heat radiating from my laptop's fan. When my landlord raised the rent, I picked up a temp job designing brochures for a real estate firm, the kind of work Lucas would have mocked. I didn't care. It bought me time to keep coding. There were nights I sat on the floor exhausted watching headlights streak past my window, wondering if I'd made a mistake. But each time I remembered the sound of my father's voice, calm, absolute, final. If you walk out now, don't expect to walk back in. Good, I thought. I don't plan to. One morning, months later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, Evolve Build Preliminary Funding Interest. I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. A small firm in Phoenix wanted to meet. They'd seen my prototype online and thought it could change the way developers conceptualize space. I stared at the screen for a long time. My fingers trembled when I typed my reply, Tuesday works, thank you for believing in what I'm building. When I hit send, something inside me shifted. The fear that had followed me since that night at the dinner table finally began to fade. They thought cutting me off would end me. But all it did was set me free. The first office of Evolve Build wasn't really an office at all. It was a corner of my apartment, a folding table pressed against a cracked window, a laptop that overheated after 30 minutes, and a whiteboard that wobbled every time I wrote on it. But in that tiny space, surrounded by the sound of city traffic and the hum of cheap fluorescent lights, I started building my empire. The first few months were brutal. I woke up every day before dawn, brewed coffee from a thrifted machine, its bitter flavor a mix of dust and sheer willpower, and worked until I could see small, insistent streaks of light vibrating at the edges of my vision. My savings were gone, my rent was late, and the only thing keeping me alive was the idea that someday this would all make sense. The prototype, a virtual architectural simulation tool, was messy and incomplete, but it was mine. Every click, every crash, every fix was a reminder that I didn't need my father's money to create something real. I worked 12 hours a day, then took freelance jobs, designing websites for local businesses to pay the bills. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I'd look out the window and see the faint glow of the city skyline. I just needed to remember that the air he breathed was filtered through my father's money. The thought didn't hurt. It hardened me. One evening while scrolling through online forums, I came across a post from an entrepreneur named Jonah who was looking for a partner on an energy-efficient housing project. I messaged him immediately explaining my vision for Evolve Build and how my software could visualize eco-designs in real time. He replied within the hour, "Meet me tomorrow. If you're half as good as you sound, we've got something." We met at a rundown coffee shop near the train station. He was older. His eyes held deep creases, not from age, but from the track marks of countless sleepless nights solving code errors. I showed him my demo on my glitchy laptop. He watched silently, leaning forward as the digital model of a sustainable home unfolded on the screen. When it ended, he looked up and smiled. "It's rough," he said, "but it's genius." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Jonah became my first real collaborator. He didn't have much money, but he had connections, people who believed in innovation, not legacy. We rented a small workspace together above a bakery. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread drifted up the stairwell, while we sketched, coded, and argued over everything from color palettes to funding strategies. One night after a 14-hour day, I collapsed onto the office floor surrounded by empty coffee cups and pizza boxes. Jonah tossed me a blanket. "You know," he said, "most people would have quit by now." "Most people," I replied, "didn't grow up being told they'd fail." He laughed softly. "So this is revenge." "It's vindication," I said, "that I am not the waste of potential they thought I was." Months passed. Slowly Evolve. Build started getting noticed. A local magazine wrote a short feature on the young woman reimagining virtual construction. It wasn't Forbes, but it was something. We landed a small contract for a sustainable housing firm in Nevada. The payment barely covered our expenses, but it was proof that I could build something valuable without the Evans name. Then came the night that nearly broke me. Our software crashed during a client demo. The entire system froze the 3D model, vanishing into a black screen just as I was explaining our interface. I tried to recover it, but nothing worked. The clients exchanged awkward glances. One of them whispered, "Maybe she's not ready for big projects yet." After they left, I sat there in silence, staring at the dark screen. Jonah placed a hand on my shoulder. "You'll fix it," he said. "I can't afford another mistake," I whispered. He gave a half smile. "Then don't call it a mistake. Call it a test." I spent the next 48 hours living on instant soup, working until my fingers cramped and the monitor felt like it was burning my retinas. The coffee was colder than my patience before I could even take a third sip, fueling my diminishing resolve. I didn't sleep. I tore the entire system down, rewriting code line by line, fighting the phantom sound of that client whispering, "Maybe she's not ready." When the model finally reappeared, smoother, faster, stronger, I leaned back in my chair and laughed until my throat hurt. That failure had forced me to rebuild everything from the ground up, and it worked. A week later, one of Jonah's contacts from a development firm in Seattle asked for a full demonstration. It was our chance, maybe our only one. I couldn't afford a plane ticket, so I drove 16 hours straight rehearsing my pitch at every rest stop. When I arrived exhausted but determined, the investors were already waiting in a glass conference room overlooking the city. I set up the demo, hands trembling. "Good morning," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm Clara Evans, founder of Evolve Build." One of the investors raised an eyebrow. "Evans? Any relation to Evans Construction?" I paused. The question hung heavy in the air. "No," I said finally. "Completely different foundation." The demo ran perfectly. When it ended, the lead investor looked at me, then at his team. "How much are you asking for?" I told him. My voice didn't shake. He nodded. "We'll be in touch." 2 days later, I got the email, "Approved." "Congratulations." I sat at my tiny desk and stared at the screen, my vision blurring. Jonah burst into the room seconds later, waving his phone. "We did it," we celebrated with takeout noodles and a box of cheap wine, and in that dim light it felt more gratifying than any champagne toast at the Evans house. For the first time, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like someone who had built something from nothing, something that couldn't be taken away. I closed the laptop and whispered, "You have your empire. I'll build mine." And for the first time, I believed it. 6 months after being cut off, the world finally called me back, not with sympathy, but with a contract. I was sitting at my desk, half asleep, over a cup of cold coffee, when my laptop chimed. I didn't expect much. Most of my inbox was filled with polite rejections or silence. But the subject line stopped me cold. "Proposal approved. $220,000 project budget." For a moment, I just stared. Then I read it again. And again. The words blurred, then sharpened, until I felt each letter press against my retina as if they had finally found their chance to manifest. Someone had finally said yes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, the glow of the screen lighting my face, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: validation. Real tangible proof that I wasn't just surviving. I was becoming. The deal came from a man named William Hart, an investor who specialized in sustainable architecture. He had seen a demo of my software at a small tech showcase and requested a meeting in person. When he called, his tone was curious, not condescending at first. "I'll be honest," he said over the phone. "I expected a whole team behind Evolve Build, not one woman working out of a rented space above a bakery." I smiled. "You'd be surprised what fits into a small space when you refuse to quit." He laughed. "I like that answer. Let's talk numbers." We met at his office downtown, a minimalist place filled with glass walls and soft light. He listened as I explained the system, the interface, the way virtual design could cut construction costs and visualize energy flow. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said simply, "You built this alone?" "Yes," I said, with a plan devised at 3 a.m. and the certainty I'd never have to hear from them again. He chuckled and stood extending his hand. Then it's time we build something bigger together. When I signed the contract, the pen felt heavier than gold. It wasn't the $220,000. It was the weight of every past dismissal now validated by ink and signature. Not charity, not luck, a business deal. That night I walked home instead of taking the bus. The air was cold, sharp, and alive. My reflection followed me in every dark window, a reminder that I wasn't the invisible girl at the family table anymore. I didn't call my father. I didn't text Lucas. I wanted to for a moment to throw it in their faces to let them know the daughter they'd written off had just made her first $250,000 deal. But no. The best revenge is not loud. It is a solid foundation they will eventually have to try and buy. The next morning, I wired my first payroll to Jonah and the 2 interns we'd hired. We worked in that same old bakery loft surrounded by the smell of bread and the hum of cheap computers. But now there was a purpose. We weren't chasing dreams anymore. We were delivering them. Jonah raised a paper cup of coffee like a toast. Here's to proving them wrong. I smiled. Not wrong. Irrelevant. We built for months, refining every detail. The design that started as a late-night sketch became something living and breathing, an immersive 3D world where clients could walk through their future homes before a single brick was laid. The first test run was perfect. A week later, William called again. "Your model's generating buzz," he said. "I want to feature it in a conference next month. Are you ready to show the world?" My pulse quickened. I've been ready since they told me I wasn't. The conference was held in a sleek downtown hotel. I stood behind a booth made from a rented table and a banner I'd printed at a copy shop. Compared to the other setups, massive displays, glossy brochures, endless marketing teams, I looked small. But when the demo started, people stopped walking. They watched. They asked questions. For the first time, the word genius didn't sound sarcastic. A woman from a development firm pulled me aside after the presentation. "How much are you charging for a private license?" I hesitated, a wave of coldness washing down my back, but that chill was the perfect bedrock for confidence. $200,000. She smiled. "Done. Send the paperwork." Just like that, Evolve Build wasn't an idea anymore. It was an industry. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment with Jonah eating takeout noodles straight from the carton. "You realize this changes everything, right?" he said. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I'm not telling them yet." He looked at me puzzled. "Your family? You're really going to hide this?" I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, the bitterness grounding me. They taught me to measure success in silence. I'm just returning the favor. In the weeks that followed, the contracts multiplied. More firms wanted partnerships. More investors called, more emails came with numbers that used to feel impossible. But nothing, not 1 0 on any check, felt as good as that first one. A week later, I saw a familiar name in a trade publication. Evans Construction had announced a new luxury development and a major delay due to design inefficiencies. The article mentioned they were seeking consultants to resolve energy flow issues. I stared at the page for a long moment, then whispered to myself, what if they hire me? The idea was insane and brilliant. That night, I began drafting a proposal titled Evolve Build X Evans Construction, a Sustainable Collaboration. It wasn't just business. It was poetic justice. By midnight, I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor soft against my face. I imagined walking back into that world, the one that had exiled me, and owning it from the inside. I smiled, closed my laptop, and whispered into the dark, let them laugh a little longer. When I come back, they'll call me a shareholder. The invitation came in the mail, printed on ivory cardstock with gold lettering, just like every year. Thanksgiving dinner at the Evans residence. I almost threw it away. For years, I had built an entire life around not needing them. But something about the timing, maybe the success, maybe the irony, made me pause. This year, I wasn't just Clara, the daughter who'd been cut off. I was the founder of a multi-million-dollar firm. The difference was, no one at that table knew it yet. The house looked the same as it always had, grand polished hollow, the same faint smell of roasted turkey and pride. When my mother opened the door, her expression flickered between surprise and guilt. "Clara," she said softly, "you came." "I did," I said, handing her a store-bought pie. "Figured I'd bring something safe." Lucas appeared a moment later, dressed in a tailored suit, even though it was just dinner. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I make buildings before they're built," I said, smiling back. "You know, the kind that doesn't collapse halfway through development." He froze for half a second before smirking. "Still have that sharp mouth, huh? Still have that thin skin, huh?" I replied. The dining room felt less like a dinner and more like a performance, the tables stretching between us like a feudal boundary. The chandelier light was brittle and sharp, but the true weight of the dinner lay in the silent, perfectly aligned silverware and the tight silence they were trying to fill. "Clara, my father began carving the pie. Your mother tells me you're still running that, a digital design company, Evolve Build," I said evenly. Lucas leaned back, swirling his wine. "Sounds like one of those projects that builds only on paper, then gets dissolved before it can break ground." I smiled faintly, cutting a small piece of pie. "And some people are made to underestimate others. You've always been great at that." My cousin Heather leaned in, her voice sweet but edged. "Clara, you should let Lucas mentor you. Maybe he could show you how to handle real clients." I turned to her, smiling gently. "Maybe he could show me how to fake confidence in a room full of people who already want to like you." The room went still. Lucas wasn't finished. He tipped his head, narrowing his eyes as if scrutinizing an unknown object. "You seem calm," he said. "You must love the thrill of uncertainty." "I do, actually. Being outside the bubble my father created for you is quite liberating." "You're still looking for work, aren't you?" Lucas pressed. "Careful downtown. Rent there can cost more than the value of a failed startup." I cut another piece of pie, slow and deliberate. "Funny, Lucas. I was going to say the same thing about the company's Q3 losses." Dad set down his knife with a sigh. "He's right about one thing, Clara. You always had big ideas but no follow-through. Sometimes I think you were afraid of success. Or maybe I was just afraid of becoming like you." The silence was sharp enough to taste. Lucas smiled triumphant. "You know, Dad, it's good Clara came tonight. It's important for her to stay grounded, especially since she's not part of the company anymore. The will, the board, all of it, it's finalized now." I leaned back, folding my napkin. "So that's how it is." My phone buzzed under the table. I glanced down. "David Walker, attorney. One message preview, confirmed. Ownership transfer filed successfully. You now hold 52% of Evans Construction voting shares." My heart didn't skip. It steadied. I looked back up at Lucas, who was still smiling like a man who believed he'd won. "You're right," I said quietly. "That's how it is." He raised his glass. "To my family," he said, "and to success that actually lasts." I lifted my glass too, meeting my father's eyes. "To family," I echoed. "And to succeed, you can't take it away." As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me, smelling of pine and clean melting snow, an absolute purification after the performance inside. The laughter resumed behind me. Let them enjoy their last meal as the powerful ones. The game had already changed. They just didn't know it yet. I woke up the next morning feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the cold emptiness of a machine finally brought online. I lay still, replaying the dinner, the feel of the phone in my hand, the knowledge that I carried the truth they couldn't conceive. My silence had become their undoing. I walked to the window. The house, usually heavy with arrogance, now felt fragile. It was a structure built on sand, waiting for the tide to turn. I spent the morning reading the trade publication again. Evans Construction expands legacy with new leadership. Lucas's face mocked me from the screen. But the adjacent article, the one about the luxury development delay due to design inefficiencies, was all the information I needed. My father and Lucas thought I was a failure because I didn't play their game. They missed the simple truth: I was never playing to fail. I was playing to own the board. I spent the next hour working on the proposal, refining the language. It wasn't about being hired, it was about infiltration. They needed a solution, and I would be their necessary poison. Evolve. Build X Evans Construction, a sustainable collaboration. I imagined their faces when they opened that email, realizing that the technology they dismissed was the only thing that could save their multi-million-dollar mistake. By noon, I had the final draft. I didn't send it yet. I needed the final play, the moment of pure, unadulterated power. I drove out and found a small, quiet park overlooking the city skyline. I stared at the towering structures, each one a monument to someone else's ambition. Soon, I would be shaping that skyline too. I pulled out my phone and dialed David Walker. My thumb hovered over David's number. For all the control I'd maintained at the dinner table, a tremor started in my hand, running up my arm. This was the point of no return. This call didn't just activate my shares. It detonated the last bridge between me and the Evans name. My throat was dry, and I had to remind myself to breathe a slow, deep intake of air that tasted like the cold outside. My reflection stared back from the glass screen, not the calm architect, but a woman standing on the edge of an irreversible decision. "Do it," a voice whispered, the one that sounded like pure, hardened clarity. "End the lie." "David." I said, my voice steady. "I have the opening move. I want the press release scheduled for tomorrow morning. Are you sure, Clara? Once it's public, there's no negotiating the terms of your ownership." "I'm sure," I said. "It's time to stop waiting for their approval. It's time for them to start waiting for mine." I drove back to my small apartment, feeling the kind of exhaustion that precedes victory. I had walked away from their world with nothing, and now I was walking back and owning the very ground they stood on. It was barely sunrise when my phone rang. The name flashing on the screen, David Walker, attorney, sent a cold electric current running down my spine, chasing away the last trace of sleep. His voice, calm and deliberate, delivered the final word. "Congratulations, Ms. Evans," he said. "It's official. You are now the majority shareholder of Evans Construction." "Say it again," I whispered. "You own 52% of the company," he repeated. "Effective immediately." I let out a soft laugh, quiet, almost disbelieving. "After all these years?" David chuckled. "Your father should have read the fine print before transferring those convertible shares. When Evans Construction merged with Hart Development last quarter, your stake through Evolve Build was activated automatically. They didn't even notice until we filed." I sat up, the sheet falling around me. "So it's done. No going back." "No going back," he said. "And Clara, the press release goes live in an hour. You'll want to be ready." I walked to the window. The city outside was painted in a layer of leaden fog and a sharp steel-colored light, like the schematic for a battle. I thought of the Evans house. Let them read it over breakfast. At 8:15, the phone rang again. Lucas. His voice was tight-controlled, the way people sound when they're trying not to panic. "Clara, what the hell did you do?" I followed through. 52%. "How Dad said those shares were protected. Dad said a lot of things," I interrupted. "Most of them are wrong. Do you have any idea what this means? The board's in chaos. Investors are calling non-stop. You blindsided everyone." "Good. It's about time. You can't run it alone. You don't know what we deal with every day. I've been running my own company for 5 years, Lucas. The difference is I learned how to survive outside the bubble my father created for you, and now I hold the valve." He exhaled sharply. "Dad wants to talk to you. I'm sure he does." "Don't make this personal," he said, voice cracking. "It's always been personal," I replied. "So what happens now?" "Now," I said quietly, "we rebuild. But this time I will decide what gets demolished." When I hung up, I felt a sudden coldness, not fear but the sheer terrifying calm of a deep ocean current finally turning. I had stopped being their failure. I was my own success. Around noon, I received one more message, not from my lawyer, not from Lucas, but from my father. No subject line. Just 2 words. "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "At dinner." Because if the first call changed everything, the next conversation would end it. By the time I arrived at the Evans estate that evening, the air was already heavy with tension. The house glowed like it always had, warm light spilling from the tall windows, laughter from inside pulled thin and brittle, like a thread stretched taut and about to snap. But beneath that glow, I could feel the shift. The balance of power had changed. When the butler opened the door, his eyes flicked up in surprise, then quickly down again. "Ms. Evans," he said softly, as if he'd just been told to use my name differently. "Your family is waiting in the dining room." "Of course they are," I said, walking inside. The same chandelier still hung above the table, glinting gold and glass. The same crystal glasses perfectly set. The same faces: my father, my mother Lucas, and a few extended family members, each one pretending this was just another family dinner. But it wasn't. My father stood as I entered, hands clasped behind his back. "Clara," he said. His voice was calm, but the strain beneath it was visible. "We were just talking about you," I nodded, reaching for my glass of water. "I bet you were." I set my purse down and took my seat at the opposite end of the table. Lucas sat beside him, his jaw tight. He didn't look at me at first. He was the first to break the silence. "You blindsided us, Clara. Publicly. You mean I made a business move? Isn't that what we were raised to do?" "This isn't a game," he snapped. "It wasn't a game when you laughed at me over pie last night either," I said, my voice low and quiet. "But here we are." My father leaned forward, the faintest edge of command creeping into his tone. "You could have come to us privately. We could have discussed it as a family." I met his gaze and smiled. "You mean the way you discussed the will that silenced him?" My mother squeezed her water glass, her knuckles turning white. "Clara, please, let's not make this ugly." I gave a short, quiet laugh. "Ugly. You made it ugly the moment you decided your daughter wasn't worth believing in." Lucas pushed back his chair, standing. "You think this is revenge, don't you? That taking over the company makes you even? You have no idea what you've started." I met his eyes. "I started Evolve Build with nothing but debt and a laptop that barely turned on. And now, I own your company. I think I know exactly what I've started." He opened his mouth to reply, but my father raised a hand to silence him. "Sit down." The command tone was still there, the same one that used to make everyone fall in line. But it didn't work anymore. Not on me. He turned his gaze on me. "Let's speak plainly. What do you want, Clara?" For a long moment I didn't answer. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall filled the silence. Then I spoke quietly. "I want what I've earned." "And what's that?" he asked, voice cold. "Respect," I said. "The one thing this family never gave me." He shook his head, his voice rising just slightly. "You think power will give you that ownership? It won't. You'll learn soon enough that it's a burden." "I've carried heavier ones," I said. Lucas leaned forward. "So what now, Clara? You think you're going to come in and run everything? Replace Dad? Replace me?" I smiled faintly. No. I will proceed with restructuring the entire foundation. And you are part of the spreadsheet." His jaw clenched. "You'll destroy everything we built." "You mean everything I built for you," I corrected. "You don't even realize it yet, do you? The systems you use, the models that made your last expansion possible, those came from my software." The words landed like a slap. My father froze. "What? You bought?" "Evolve Builds designs last year through a third-party contract." I said, my tone calm but sharp. "You didn't even know it was mine. That's how little you cared to pay attention." My mother gasped softly. Lucas's color drained. "That's not possible." "It's business," I said. "And business is all about knowing who you're really dealing with." The silence that followed was pure disbelief. Then my father's composure cracked just slightly. "So you've been manipulating us?" "No," I said. "I've been watching you. You made me invisible, remember? It was easy to move in the shadows you created." He sat back slowly, his expression unreadable. "So this is your revenge?" I shook my head. "No, Dad. Revenge would have been selling the company to your competitors. What I did was justice." Lucas stood again, pacing. You're destroying the name I spent my whole life trying to validate. I met his stare without flinching. Maybe. But at least I'm not dependent on a last name to prove I exist. He slammed his hand on the table. You're destroying everything Dad worked for. I stood too, my voice low and steady. No, Lucas. I'm saving it. You've been bleeding the company dry with bad contracts and ego-driven decisions. The investors know it. That's why they came to me. The color drained from his face. They went to you months ago, I said. They wanted stability. I gave them innovation. You gave them excuses. My father rose slowly, the years of command faltering for the first time. You can't lead this family through humiliation. I met his gaze. I'm not leading through humiliation. I'm leading through the truth. The sound of my phone buzzing broke the tension. Every head turned toward it. I glanced down a message from my PR director. Press conference live. Statement delivered. The media response was overwhelming. I looked back up at them. It's done. The company knows. The city knows. By tomorrow morning, the world will know. My father's expression hardened, but behind it I saw something I hadn't seen in years: uncertainty. Lucas's voice came out low, almost pleading. Clara, don't do this. I already did. For a moment, no one spoke. The chandelier light shimmered across the table, catching the gold in the wine glasses and the tension in every breath. Then I reached for my coat. I didn't come here to gloat, I said softly. I came here to end the lie. My father's voice cracked slightly. And what happens now? I paused at the doorway, glancing back once. Now I said we find out what the Evans name really stands for without the illusion. Then I walked out. Behind me, the sound of their voices rose: confusion, anger, fear. The same family that once laughed at me now sat stunned, their empire trembling beneath the truth. Outside, the night air was cold and clean, the sky streaked with distant stars. My phone buzzed again. Another message from David. You did it. I smiled, slipping the phone into my pocket. I know. The morning after the dinner felt like I had woken up in a still photograph, and I was the only person permitted to move. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing: emails, news alerts, voicemails from reporters. My face was everywhere. Headlines ran across every business outlet: Evans Construction under new leadership. Majority shareholder revealed to be founder of Evolve Build. From family outcast to industry powerhouse, the Clara Evans story. I turned off the notifications and set the phone down. The silence that followed was sharp, heavy, almost sacred. I brewed coffee slowly, deliberately. The bitterness of the dark roast was the only thing I could fully control right now. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside my apartment the air was still. Only the low hum of success filled the quiet, steady grounding, and entirely mine. At 8:45, David called. It's chaos out there, he said, voice brisk but tinged with admiration. The board's already demanding an emergency meeting. Half of them want to resign, the other half want to meet with you immediately. I smiled faintly. They'll all show up. He laughed. Of course they will. No one walks away from the new CEO. The title didn't quite sink in. CEO. The word felt too heavy, too unreal. But when I looked out at the skyline, at the cranes, the buildings, the glass towers, I'd once only dreamed of designing, it began to fit. Clara David added carefully, Your father's been calling me since dawn. I haven't picked up. You should expect him to reach out soon. I already have, I said quietly. He texted last night. He wants to meet again. Are you going to? I paused, swirling the coffee in my cup. Yes. But this time, we meet on my terms. By noon, I was standing outside the Evans Construction headquarters, the same building where I'd once been told to focus on something realistic, the same office I'd been escorted out of 5 years earlier when I refused to sign away my designs. Funny how places don't change, but people do. Inside, the lobby gleamed as always. Stone floors, glass walls, the company logo etched above the reception desk. But now my name was the one behind it all. The receptionist's voice trembled when she spoke. Ms. Evans, the board is waiting for you. Thank you, I said, walking past. When I entered the conference room, every conversation died instantly. 11 faces turned toward me, each one trying to mask a different version of fear. Some looked furious. Some looked desperate. All looked powerless. I took my seat at the head of the table, the one my father used to sit in. "Good afternoon," I said. "Let's begin." The CFO, a man who'd known me since I was a teenager, cleared his throat. "Ms. Evans, we're still trying to make sense of this situation." "The press is celebrating," I interrupted. "Let them. They're writing history, not scandal." One of the older board members leaned forward. "We don't doubt your talent, Clara, but the transition needs clarity. What's your plan?" I smiled. "Stability first, expansion second, transparency always. The company hasn't had that in a long time." Someone muttered, "Your father won't like that." I looked directly at him. "That's the point." The room went still. By the end of the hour, I had restructured the leadership strategy, scheduled an investor meeting, and rebranded the corporate direction. For the first time, the room didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like mine. When the meeting ended, I walked back into the hallway. My father was standing there waiting. He looked smaller somehow, as if the mantle of confidence he wore for years had suddenly been stripped away and he didn't know how to stand without it. "Clara," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've made your point." "I didn't come here to make a point," I said. "I came here to lead." He nodded once, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've changed." "No," I said. "You just stopped looking." We stood there in silence, the hum of the office around us filling the spaces our relationship never could. "I built this company," he said finally. "And I rebuilt it," I replied. "The difference is, I didn't build it out of fear." He exhaled slowly. "You've humiliated this family." "No," I said softly. "You humiliated yourself when you decided your son was more valuable than your daughter." He didn't respond, and for the first time I saw something break behind his eyes. Not anger, not pride, but regret. He started to speak, but the elevator doors opened, and Lucas stepped out. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Dad," he said quietly, then looked at me. "Clara, Lucas," he hesitated, glancing between us. "The board meeting's over." "It is," I said. "Then I guess congratulations are in order," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You got what you wanted." I studied him for a moment. "No, Lucas, I got what I earned." He swallowed hard, looking into the polished marble floor my mother was so proud of. "The company's not the same without Dad. It will be replaced with the truth," I said. "Get used to it." He frowned. "You mean power?" "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "Clarity." He didn't answer. He just nodded once, like a man realizing the war was over. My father turned away, muttering something under his breath about legacy and betrayal. I didn't stop him. There was nothing left to say. When they both left, I stood there for a long time, watching their reflections disappear in the glass elevator. For the first time, I wasn't the one left behind. That evening, I returned to my apartment. Power. That word used to scare me. Now it just meant ownership of choices, of pain, of peace. Winter came quietly that year. The first snow fell outside my apartment window in a soft, profound silence covering the city that had once felt too loud for me to survive in. I stood there for a long moment, coffee in hand, watching flakes melt against the glass. The cup was warm, a solid comfort against the sudden stillness of the world outside. It had been 2 weeks since the takeover. 2 weeks since the world learned my name. 2 weeks since my family had gone silent. They hadn't called. Not once. And somehow that felt like closure. At the office, things had changed overnight. Evans Construction, now rebranded as Evolve Evans Group, was running smoother than it had in years. Departments that had once drowned under Lucas's micromanagement now thrived with fresh leadership. The employees, the same people who used to treat me like I was an invisible piece of furniture in the hallways, when I was the founder's daughter, now looked me in the eye when they said good morning. Respect. The one currency I had spent years fighting to earn, and it was finally mine, not because of my name, but because of what I'd built. That afternoon, my assistant knocked softly on my door. "Ms. Evans, your mother is here to see you." I froze for a moment, fingers still on the keyboard. "Send her in," I said quietly. When she walked in, she looked smaller than I remembered, less like the poised hostess of family dinners, more like a woman trying to hold something fragile together. She smiled faintly. "You look different here." "I guess that's what happens when no one's telling you what you can't do," I said. Her eyes flicked to the photos on my shelf, press clippings, awards a framed cover of Forbes. "I saw the interview," she said softly. "You spoke well. Strong. Thank you." She sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "Your father's not doing well," she said finally. "He's proud, of course, but this has been hard for him." I nodded. "He's proud," her eyes softened. "He'd never admit it, but he always said you were too much like him," she whispered. "And that was what I feared the most." I gave a quiet laugh. "That used to be an insult." "It still might be," she said, smiling through the sadness. "But it's also the reason you survived him." The silence between us stretched, not heavy this time, just honest. Then she said what I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry, Clara, for not standing up for you sooner, for letting them decide who you were before you could." I looked at her for a long time before replying. "I stopped needing their approval a long time ago, Mom. I just needed to stop apologizing for being more than they imagined." She reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "I think you've done that." For a moment, I almost let the walls fall. But forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't an obligation, it's a choice. So I squeezed her hand once and said, "Thank you for coming." After she left, I sat there, the quiet pressing in again. Outside, snow kept falling and the skyline glowed gold against the white. Later that night, I drove out to the edge of the city to the old family estate. The lights were off except for one window in my father's office. I hesitated at the gate, unsure why I'd come. Maybe to say goodbye. Maybe to prove to myself that I didn't need this place anymore. But when I saw him standing there, silhouetted against the window, I didn't knock. I just stood under the falling snow, watching the man who once told me I didn't deserve his legacy look small inside the house I'd outgrown. Then I turned back to my car and left without a sound. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom for the company's annual address. Cameras lined the back wall. Journalists whispered. Investors leaned forward in their seats. I took my place at the head of the table. "Good morning," I said. For years, Evans Construction stood for tradition. But tradition without evolution is just decay. Today that changes. From now on, we build differently, not just for profit, but for purpose. I watched the faces around the room, some skeptical, most inspired. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was trying to prove anything. I was simply leading. When the applause came, it was genuine, the kind that filled the room without echoing hollow. After the conference, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You did it. L. Lucas." I stared at the text for a long moment before typing back. "We both did. In our own ways." I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't need one. That night I returned to my apartment. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling the city's noise. I poured a glass of wine, curled up by the window, and watched the lights flicker across the skyline, the city that had witnessed my failure and now reflected my triumph. I thought of every dinner where I'd been laughed at, every cruel comment disguised as family wisdom, every silence I'd been forced to swallow. They had all been lessons in disguise, lessons that built me sharper, quieter, stronger. Revenge wasn't loud. It didn't come in shouting matches or slammed doors. It came in calm mornings and signed contracts, in the knowledge that I no longer needed their approval to breathe. And as I sat there watching the snow fall heavier, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving me right. Because legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn brick by brick, choice by choice. I set down my glass, letting the city lights reflect in the window like fire. Somewhere out there, my last name still carried my father's weight. But soon people would hear Evans and think of something else entirely. They'd think of me. And as the night deepened, the snow piling quietly against the glass, I whispered the words I wished I'd said at that Thanksgiving dinner long ago. You don't get to decide who I am. I do. The phone buzzed one last time. Another message, this one from David. Forbes confirmed. They're naming you Businesswoman of the Year. I smiled not because of the title, but because of what it meant. The girl they once called a failure had become a legacy, and this time the silence that followed wasn't emptiness,